Okay, well, we'll get started. Good evening. Welcome to our second Great Writers, Great Readings event of fall 2021. Our final reading will be on November 17, same place, same time, when we will be joined by the poet Connie Roberts, author of Little Witness, and our own beloved colleague. I hope you guys can make that one as well. It is thrilling to be back in person. I'm especially honored to have Joshua Henkin here with us tonight, out of the Zoom box live. I met Josh back in June on Zoom, an event for the publication of our novels. We were in conversation, and when the hour was finished, it flew by. I still had so much more I wanted to hear from him. Morningside Heights, his latest novel, is a tour de force, a page-turner about ordinary people living through the horrors of early onset dementia, navigating the illness with honesty and such recognizable humanity. I often felt like the characters were my friends, and I might just bump into one of them on the street. I actually live in Morningside Heights. I remember, as a young writer, telling my father how much I loved a novel I'd just read, The Country Girls Trilogy by Edna O'Brien. Oh, you know what? I realized I can take this off. The language, the story, it's so simple, so straightforward, I said. My father, a writer himself, responded, deceptively simple. He was implying a lot of extremely hard work went into the making of the language and story in order to make it seem so beautifully simple. Writing is hard work, a message I try to convey to you, my students, so you know the pressure of having the words come out perfectly so you don't feel the pressure of the words having to come out perfectly in the first draft. Speaking with Josh about process back in June, he told me he writes thousands of pages to get the 300 or so pages that make up the novel. Case in point, deceptively simple. His language is clear, vivid. Time glides by as it likes to do with astonishing speed. We can see the entire span of a marriage in a few chapters, entire lives and family structures and dynamics are made, devolve, are made again in the short sweep of his narrative. There are many techniques at play, well hidden behind that deceptive simplicity, allowing the reader to be carried along by the buoyancy of the story, so that we believe we are privy to the inner and intimate lives of our neighbor. Joshua Henkin is the author of 3 other acclaimed novels, notable books on both the New York Times and the LA Times book lists. In addition to writing, he is also the director of Brooklyn College's MFA in fiction. Please help me welcome Joshua Henkin.
Thank you so much, Martha, for that really, really kind introduction. It's a real honor to be here, and thank you all for coming out tonight. I'm going to read for about 20, 25 minutes, and I'd love to hear questions and comments from you all. The section I'm going to read from, it's actually, Martha's right, the novel focuses on a character's dementia and how the family deals with that. But it's also a book that covers many decades, and the section I'm going to read from is in Flashback, and it's told from the point of view of a character named Arlo, who is the son from a previous marriage of Spence and Prue. Spence is the professor who eventually gets Alzheimer's, and Prue is his wife, and they have a daughter, Sarah, together, but Spence had a son from a previous marriage, and this section is told from this point of view in Flashback. Arlo Zakheim always got wind of things. He didn't have ESP exactly. He was simply more intuitive than other people. This helped him, he believed, in business and in life. He liked to have the maximum information about others while revealing the minimum information about himself. He listed his phone numbers as anonymous so that people wouldn't know who was calling. Sometimes, just for the kick of it, he would leave an automated email message. I don't feel like checking email today. I'll get back to you when the urge overtakes me. but all the while he was secretly checking. "You hate surprise," his mother told him once. Who could blame him? His own childhood had been so replete with surprise. The only constant was the surprise itself, starting with his parents' divorce when he was only 8 months old. He was convinced he could remember his parents together, but his father told him that was impossible. Arlo didn't care what his father said. He'd spent his whole life trying to forget his father, even as he yearned for him from afar, and he considered the word impossible a challenge. Impossible to hold your breath for as long as he'd held his as a baby, holding it until he turned blue. People spoke about iron wills, but scientists had yet to discover a will as strong as his. He had run 2 marathons 48 hours apart, 200 push-ups, fasting for days, lying in a hyperbaric chamber, extreme caving, tantric sex, dry orgasm. He didn't care what his father said. He remembered his parents together, recalled his father saying, "Well, good goddamn." His father who never cursed, who referred to it as cussing, who called dog shit dog dirt. "I hate my father." "Of course you do," his mother said, good at encouraging that hatred while pretending not to. Who wouldn't hate someone who abandoned him? That's not what happened. But Arlo didn't know what had happened. He just knew it was more complicated than his mother let on. Things are always more complicated, his mother said, and at the same time they're really quite simple, which was how his mother spoke in Cohen's, her meaning as obscure as her gaze. By the time he turned 10, Arlo had lived in so many places he had trouble remembering them all. His mother had once told him she wanted to poop in all 50 states. In this way, she was following in the footsteps of her father, a kosher butcher, who had moved the family from state to state, always in search of an underserved Jewish community. If Arlo had been older and more sophisticated, he would have realized his mother was visiting upon him what her father had visited upon her. He would have recalled the words of the prophet Jeremiah, "The fathers have eaten sour grapes, and the children's teeth have been set on edge." But Arlo hadn't read the Bible at that point, or much else for that matter. One day, Arlo picked up the receiver and heard his parents on the phone. "What about his schooling?" his father said. "It's required by law." The law? Why, Arlo's mother wanted to know, should she follow the law when the cops were pigs and the district attorney was too, when every lawyer was corrupt, from the lowest ambulance chaser all the way up to the attorney general? Had Arlo's father forgotten about Vietnam? Had he forgotten about the Gulf of Tonkin and the Pentagon Papers and My Lai? No, Arlo's father sighed, he hadn't. But it was beside the point, a red herring. He was talking about their son's education, and what kind of education was Arlo getting when Linda was moving him from place to place? Is that all you care about, education? Listen, Linda. Arlo's father's voice was as steady as his mother's was deranged. His father's very calmness set his mother off. The more placid he became, the more ill-tempered it made her. "I am listening," she said. "What else is there for me to do but listen to you? He's getting an education. I'm homeschooling him." Arlo stifled a laugh. He'd been in and out of a dozen schools, never staying long enough to gain traction. "You have a native intelligence," his mother said. "Now you just have to go out and cultivate it." That it was her responsibility to help him cultivate it never occurred to her. He did have a native intelligence, but he read poorly, which shamed him, and his classmates mocked him for his reading, which shamed him even more. Soon he started to skip school. His mother, busy at the cafe or bookstore or art supplier, at whatever job she'd secured that month, was too tired to fight him. If you want to play hooky, it's your loss. But secretly she was grateful for his company. So when he said, "You could homeschool me," she said, "I don't see why not." She would take him to the library, and she would become mesmerized by the rows of books, the little round stickers of the Dewey Decimal System lined up like shirt buttons on their spines. "I'm like a child in a candy store," his mother said, but a child who looked at the candy without buying any, because they would leave the library without having borrowed any book. At the local diner, Arlo's mother would flip through USA Today to the microflash of news from each of the 50 states. Okay, I'm going to homeschool you. Tell me which state this is from. But Arlo wasn't good at geography, and he couldn't possibly have known whether the home fire that killed a grandmother and her 2 grandchildren had been set in Minnesota or Vermont, or whether Arkansas was where the power had gone out. And so he was just guessing. Here, his mother said, explain to me about ERAs, and Arlo, who liked baseball and was good at math, wrote the figures on a napkin. But Arlo's mother wasn't good at math, and Arlo had to repeat the process, so if anyone was being homeschooled, it was her. Arlo's father said, "You're homeschooling him, Linda? I'm not sure what qualifies you to do that. You know how I feel about the American education system." "I'm not talking about the American education system. I'm talking about our son. What are you teaching him?" "Math, geography, social studies, physics." "Physics," he said. "You're teaching Arlo physics?" This, Arlo thought, was typical of his mother. She would get caught in the bramble of her deceit, and soon she'd be sounding ridiculous. Maybe it was those very words, geography and physics, that magnified her lie, but hearing her say them made him cough. Now his parents realized he was on the phone, and his mother was saying, "Arlo, you can't go snooping around like that." But his father said, "Wait a second, Linda. Arlo, can I have a word with you?" The phone felt heavier in Arlo's hand, and in the midday sun that pulsed through the blinds, he started to sweat. "How are you, Arlo?" "I'm okay," he said, but whenever he spoke to his father, he realized he was less okay than he thought. "I have to go," he said, and as he hung up, he heard his father say, "I love you, Arlo," the sound percussing as he walked out of the apartment and down the road, past the gas station and the laundromat and the check-cashing store, the pawn shops flashing even in daytime. If his father loved him, why didn't he come get him? Why did they only spend July together, and a week over Christmas, and a week over spring break? Secretly, Arlo slept with his father's shirt, which he'd filched on a visit to New York. His father would have given him that shirt, but the filching had been important, just as the secrecy of sleeping with it was important, knowing he was betraying his mother by sleeping with his father's shirt. When he was 12, Arlo moved with his mother to a commune in Delaware. "Oh, Arlo, all this time we were meant to live here, and I just didn't realize it." Arlo himself wasn't nearly so sure they were meant to live here, but he adjusted to the commune's routine, to morning meetings and the dividing up of tasks, to long days picking beets and radishes. He enjoyed sitting with the other children in the mess hall, the soccer and kickball games, nights in the gazebo beneath the stars. No animal products were allowed on the commune, and no sugar. Some of the commune members were on food stamps and disability. For a time, Arlo's mother was on disability herself, though Arlo was never sure what her disability was. Something about a bum ankle, but then it was a bad back. Often she used the word sciatica. Soon Arlo's mother was studying to become a midwife. "I'm getting my midwifery degree." She laughed when she said this, perhaps because she hadn't been good at getting degrees. She still had 6 credits to go at Barnard, perhaps because the commune didn't confer degrees. "It's on-the-job training," she said, "though don't go saying that to the pregnant girls. They might get nervous." Afternoons, Arlo would hitchhike into town, where he would take out his ukulele and busk. "Hey there, little man," someone said. "Take a look at the little man with his little instrument." Arlo didn't like being called a little man, and he thought his instrument was big enough, but he was happy to have a few dollars dropped into his case, so he didn't say anything. He wore a New York City subway token around his neck as a reminder of where his father lived and that he could leave whenever he wanted to. But leaving wasn't easy. There were schedules to coordinate, and his mother needed him. Soon his mother started to deliver babies. Even now, as an adult, Arlo could still recall the afterbirth, everyone gathering for a celebratory meal, starting with placenta soup. Seitan and soy cheese, he could still taste those, though now he refused to eat them. The commune members grew herbs, echinacea and ginseng and kava and St. John's wort, Men wore dashikis. The word namaste was used. There was the smell of beeswax. People walked around naked because it was warm out, and the body came in all shapes and sizes, and all shapes and sizes were beautiful. The commune generators sometimes didn't work, so there were blackouts, like the one in New York City in 1977, when Arlo's mother had been on a picnic, the lampposts and streetlights extinguished, mayonnaise oozing through her sandwich bag, while on the street the looting had started. But on the commune there was no looting. Years later, Arlo would think there was nothing to loot. They were piss poor, all of them, but at the time he thought what his mother thought, that no one looted because it was all for one and one for all, and everyone loved everyone. I'm happy here, he told his mother. Oh, darling, I'm so glad to hear that. But he just said those words because they made his mother light brighten, as if a candle had been lit inside her. His mother, with her far-off gazes, cloudy as sea glass, saying, I need some time alone, darling. Or, darling, I'm doing something for my solitary self. Or, it's just going to be the three of us, darling, me, myself, and I. Always that darling, attached like a charm to the strand of her words, allowing her to pretend she wasn't saying what she was saying. Sometimes Arlo would find his mother, not as she claimed, keeping her own company, but keeping company with a man. She'd be sitting by the campfire, her skirt bunched between her thighs, the sounds of the guitar rising with the marijuana smoke. I thought you were taking a walk. I was taking a walk, and look what I found while I was walking. Danny, this is my son, Arlo. Hello, Arlo, Danny said, and he laughed, and Arlo's mother did too, and so did the man sitting next to Danny, and the woman sitting next to that man, so the laughter was going around the campfire like the bong. I named him after Arlo Guthrie, Arlo's mother said. Well, hello, Arlo Guthrie, Danny said. And now the man on the guitar was playing Ukulele Lady, and Arlo's mother said, That's funny, because Arlo plays the ukulele, don't you, darling? And Arlo had to admit he did. The year he was 13, on his annual Christmas visit, Arlo brought the map he'd drawn with all the states he'd lived in. His sister Sarah was only 10, but she was precocious and quick-witted, and she had a copy of the world map puttied to her wall. She had long auburn hair, curls catapulting this way and that, which Arlo detested. He kept finding clumps of hair in the sink. Can't you clean up after yourself? But Sarah didn't deign to respond. She just did what she always did, leaving her hair wherever she saw fit, playing geography with her mother and ghosts with her father, and before she went to sleep, she practiced her violin and ate a snack of 3 marshmallows and a handful of Wise potato chips. Arlo was dazzled by the marshmallows and potato chips, by the cans of Fresca that lined his father's fridge. You can bring that food home with you, his mother said. We'll get you a pouch, or 3 extra stomachs like a cow has. But the commune doesn't allow junk food. True enough, she said. I guess you'll have to do with your single stomach. When Prue served pasta for dinner, Arlo would compete with Sarah, whom he thought of as half his age and half his size, so she should get half as much food. It was dumb luck that he'd ended up where he was. Just as easily, he could have had the potato chips and the marshmallows and the nice home, the bedroom that smelled of lemon, the washcloths in the bathroom hanging like flags. Life was unfair, but in his father's apartment, he would make up for it. If Sarah had 2 portions of fettuccine, he would have 3. If she had 3 portions, he would have 4. He ate as fast as he could, because to the fastest eater went the spoils. So when his father said, Arlo, have you taken up speed eating? Arlo just stared back at him uncomprehendingly, thinking, what other kind of eating is there? Now, as an adult, Arlo could have eaten as much pasta as he liked, but he studiously avoided refined carbohydrate. At 6 feet tall, he weighed 138 pounds. He did 200 crunches every morning, followed by 200 push-ups. His composition of body fat was 8%, which put him ahead of most professional athletes. He had become like his father, who had once said that if only he didn't have to eat and sleep, he would get so much more done. Arlo himself got by on 4 hours of sleep a night, and he was on a restricted calorie diet. He ate little and he ate fast. Little because he was hoping to achieve immortality. Mice and chimpanzees kept on a restricted calorie diet lived 50% longer, and he was out to prove it would work for humans too. Fast because, though his will was unassailable, he'd never been able to break the habit born from those visits to his father, when, if he ate faster than his sister, he would get extra food. It was on that trip to his father's when he was 13 that the full extent of his deprivation settled on Arlo. One night, he showed Sarah the map he'd drawn. He'd lived in 9 states, and Sarah had lived in only 1. My mother has pooped in 39 states. How many states has your mother pooped in? Sarah had no idea how many states her mother had pooped in, and she didn't care. Here, she said, grabbing the map, you drew this all wrong. You've got Maine over here where California's supposed to be, and Illinois might as well be in Europe. And Delaware, where you live, you've placed it in the middle of the country, practically in mountain time. Delaware was in the middle of the country, Arlo wanted to say, because the Commune was the center of everything. That night, Arlo overheard Sarah saying to Prue, he's 13 years old and I'm smarter than him. There are different kinds of knowledge, darling, different ways of being smart. He hasn't had the same opportunities as you. Lying in bed, Arlo seethed, but he didn't seethe at Sarah or at Prue. He seethed at his mother, who had moved him like a chess piece around the country. What good was living in so many places if you put Illinois where Europe was supposed to be? And what kind of mother were you if you claimed to love your son, but you didn't teach him anything? On the bus back home, Arlo unwrapped the egg salad sandwich Prue had made for him. She'd given him a second sandwich, too, tucked into a pouch, and he thought of the pouch his mother had talked about, of the cow with its extra 3 stomachs. Prue had also given him a palmier. They're French, she said, though in English they're called elephant ears. Their size aside, they were in fact enormous. Arlo thought they looked nothing like elephant ears, but then he realized he didn't know what elephant ears looked like. It was just another thing he didn't know, and as the bus passed from New Jersey into Pennsylvania, his hatred for his mother grew and grew, and he hoped she wouldn't be there to greet him. But when he got to the station, she was at the front of the line, such eagerness across her face, he thought she might asphyxiate him. Arlo. He hated hearing his name like that, hated being named after Arlo Guthrie. At Barnard, his mother would leave class early to stand in line at the bitter end. That was why she dropped out of college, to follow Arlo Guthrie, the way people were starting to follow the Grateful Dead. She was the original deadhead, his mother liked to say, though what she really was an Arlo Guthrie head. What a strange, improbable couple his parents had been. He'd once asked his mother how she and his father had ended up together, and she said, how does anyone end up together? You're young and you fall in love. I'll tell you one thing, though. Don't go marrying your college sweetheart. It's like driving while impaired. One day when Arlo was 15, his mother said, we're leaving the Commune. It's time to move on. Why? When he'd first gotten to the Commune, he'd been unhappy, but now that he'd lived there for 3 years, it was home to him. A few days later, Arlo heard a rumor that his mother was being kicked out. Something had gone wrong at a Commune member's birth. An umbilical cord noosed around a baby's throat, oxygen loss, a heart rate plummeting, brain damage, people were saying. The child would be debilitated for life. Did something happen to a baby you delivered? Oh, Arlo, that's just awful. Why in the world would you say that? Did it? Do you know how many babies I've delivered? I did the best I could with the training I had. So it's true. But there were tears in his mother's eyes, and he knew he had to stop talking. When he spoke again, he said, I want to go live with my father. What makes you think your father wants to live with you? I just do. Arlo was right. The timing was good, his father said. It was June, and this way Arlo could get settled in New York before the school year started. Could I give you some advice, his mother said? Don't go burning bridges. As he watched his mother put her clothes in a suitcase, Arlo thought he was destined to live out his life this way, standing there once more while his mother packed her bags, poised between comprehension and incomprehension. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you. So thank you. So I'd love to take questions about just about anything, about the book, about writing. I addition to, as Martha said, in addition to writing, I teach writing, so I spend a lot of time with people like you, and I'm really happy to talk about. Yeah, so that's a great question. It was the book. The book took me 8 years to write, and as Martha alluded to before, I threw out 1,000 pages. So 90% of what I wrote isn't in the book. And my favorite scene still from the book is never made it. So you have to kill your darlings. But I think one of the reasons that the book took so long to write, just beyond the fact that just books take as long as they do, was the structure. And so the book covers really almost 5 decades, and it's told not exactly in linear fashion, told in 8 sections. And I think for me, one of the real struggles had to do with Arlo, who in some way was the easiest character for me, and in some ways the hardest. He was the easiest character in the sense that his voice came to me pretty readily, but he's also someone who, because of temperament and because of circumstance, disappears for years at a time. I needed to find a structure that would both capture his presence and his absence. When he's present, he kind of sucks the oxygen out of the room. And when he's absent, he's just gone and no one hears from him. And so I was probably in year 6 of writing the book, and I just couldn't crack the structure. And I was asked to blurb a novel called Improvement by Joan Silber. And I've been meaning to tell Joan this. It's a great book, but in addition, there was something about that book, the way that book was structured, not even sure what it was, that allowed me to figure out how to structure this book in 8 sections, so that I was able to skip what I needed to skip and include what I needed to include. I do think that it's so much about rewriting, at least for me, and if different people do this differently, so much about rewriting is figuring what I can get away with excluding. I really feel like the burden of proof is on the inclusion, and I think of Hemingway's metaphor of the tip of the iceberg. That what's sticking out of the iceberg, what's sticking out of the water, is what you're seeing on the page. But ideally, if it's a solid iceberg, then the tip, implies what's beneath the water. Sometimes I'll talk to my graduate students, and after workshop, and I'll say, I'm not sure you yet really know your characters. And I'll ask them a series of questions about their characters. And if they're defensive, as they occasionally are, they'll say, well, I don't see why that has to be in the story. And the answer is it doesn't have to be in the story, but you need to know it. And what you know gets infused in the story. And so if people ask me, don't you wish you hadn't thrown out those 2,700 pages? And I kind of feel like no. I mean, in other words, I feel like you need to write the bad pages to get to the good pages. They're really, the bad days are investments in the good days. So I kind of feel like nothing's a waste. And unfortunately there are no shortcuts. Yeah.
So so you do a very good job in kind of setting up the context and with the flashback and everything. And I was wondering, how do you kind of fight that balance between rather than showing your audience, telling your audience? That's a lot of us don't tell your audience what's happening. Show them. How do you balance that in terms of flashback and giving context?
Yeah, well, I think that's a great question. I think that I might have a very long-winded answer to give. I'm going to try to make it shorter-winded, not do my 3,000-page version of that answer. I I mean, I think the question applies for both front story and back story, because I think that, especially if you're writing the kind of book that I wrote where you have multiple narratives, the question of what's flashback and what's not flashback is almost beside the point, because the backstory is being told in scene in the same way that the front story is being told in the scene. As for the question of show, don't tell, I teach one of the classes I teach to our MFA students is the graduate craft class. And we have one class that's largely on what I call the lie of show, don't tell. And what I mean by that is that there is a truth to the idea of show, don't tell. I mean, fiction is a dramatic art, and let me backtrack. And now I am getting long-winded, but so the very first workshop I was in as a student, eons ago now, there was a student in the class who wrote the following sentence: "An incredible feeling of happiness washed over her." And the instructor said, okay, well, so first of all, get rid of the washed over cliche. And then also, if you can evoke an incredible feeling of happiness in the course of an entire novel, then you've done a very impressive thing. It doesn't follow from that you can never say a character was happy. You just have to recognize that those three words, Sally was happy, can only do so much work. But I do think that the phrase show, don't tell has been taken literally and can be a kind of like weird compact between a lazy instructor and a lazy student. And so what you end up getting is Mad Libs instead of fiction. And what I mean by that is stories that do an exquisite job of describing a couch. And I'm all for describing a couch if a couch needs to be described. But, I mean, tell Virginia Woolf, tell Alice Munro that you could only show and not tell, and they would think you're crazy. I mean, what's complicated about this is that it's easier to describe a couch than it is to describe loneliness. And it's certainly you're certainly much less likely to get called cheesy for describing a couch than for describing loneliness. And so there are ways to describe loneliness, but that involve both showing and telling. I actually think that the distinction between showing and telling is kind of false. And that, I mean, not to be obtuse, but really the only thing that the writer is showing is, characters on a page. And so what a writer is always doing is trying to make the reader feel something through a combination of dramatization and summary, through a combination of description and internality. If you're just showing, then you are writing a movie, which is a perfectly good thing to write. But the fact that movies often have to resort kind of clunkily to voiceovers is a way of illustrating what fiction can do that film can't do in terms of internality, in terms of moving through time. And so, if you were to say, he was nervous versus he bit his fingernail. According to that show don't tell rubric, I suppose he was nervous is telling, and I suppose he bit his fingernail is showing. If I had to choose between the two, I would choose he was nervous, just because he bit his fingernail is such a generic gesture of anxiety that it seems insufficiently imagined, and not that he was nervous is such a great sentence and can do so much work. But I would choose that over the other one. But I think it's 6 to 1, half a dozen of the other. So yes, I mean, you can't just say she's happy and make the reader feel happy. You've got to use your sentences, use your cadences, use your word choice, the feel of your prose to evoke emotion. But it doesn't follow that you can never say what a character is feeling. You just have to do it well. And so I think of fiction as show and tell. You're showing and telling, and sometimes it's not even clear what you're doing. You're just basically trying to make the reader feel something through your words. And you use your words in various different ways to try to have an emotional impact. And it's really, really hard to do which is why you have to revise over and over and over again. It takes so much time. Yeah.
All right, so basically my question has to do with imposter syndrome, and I know like so many writers have talked about how there are days or just periods of time where they're like, this is garbage, I'm garbage, I don't really know what I'm doing. And like, what do you deal with that? Obviously would be the first part of the question. And then how do you deal with it? I know obviously writing 30,000 pages, probably like discipline goes into like just kind of powering through it. But what would you say to like the young writer who maybe their self-consciousness is?
Yeah. Well, I can only speak for myself, but I guess also for friends of mine who I've talked about this with. I think the imposter syndrome never goes away. So, and I know that young writers don't like to hear that because they think that you're being patronizing, but it's really, it's really true. The most I can say about having, published 4 books is that I know that I've been in that place in the past where I was 100% sure it couldn't work. And I eventually made it work. So I know that when I'm lost in the forest, I know that I've been lost in the forest before and I got out. But that's pretty meager consolation in the sense that when you're lost in the forest, you're lost in the forest. And knowing that you got out doesn't make you feel less lost. And I also think that you just, I guess I know that nothing I write will be so horrible that it wouldn't pass freshman comp. But, will it jump off the page and will it be magical? There's a lot of mystery there. And we all know that experience of reading a book by a writer we admire and then reading another book by them. We just don't like it as much. And then we read a third book by that writer and we like it. We like that one again. And so, you can't, you keep going to the well, but the well, you always worry that the well is going to be dry. In terms of what to do, and it's interesting. I'm thinking about this a lot because, I've been teaching MFA students for, quite a while now and directing Brooklyn's program for 11, 12 years. And so, I've seen a lot of our students see how they've done after they've graduated. And some of them have done very well, and some of them have done less well. And there's certainly a lot of luck involved, but it's more than luck, and it has not always been the case that the ones who were most talented are the ones who did best. There are people who are their own best friends and people who are their own worst enemies. And I mean that on a couple of levels. So first of all, one of the paradoxes of wanting to publish is that kind of the only way you're going to publish is if you're going to do it even if you don't publish. By which I mean you've got to love the work, you've got to focus on the work, and you got to think of it as work, like you put in an honest day's work. And so one thing I do with my graduate students is that they have an assignment, which is they have to write 3 hours a day, 6 days a week. They mostly don't fulfill that. They mostly don't make it, but they know that that's what they need to be shooting for. Everyone keeps track of their hours, and then in class the next week, I don't make them fess up with their names attached, but I hand out little slips of paper, and they write down their hours, and we talk about how they can get closer to 18, and some of them do get to 18. Over winter break, I hold a pizza contest where we all count our hours for our 7-week break. And I played too, although I'm not pizza eligible. And at the end of the break, I deliver a pizza to the door of the person who had the most hours. And the reason I do these things is because first of all, I believe the people who like to count words and the people who like to count time. I'm a big advocate of counting time because I feel like time is neutral. You can write 3 hours and write 3 words, and you can write 3 hours and write 10 pages. But those 3-word days are investment in the 10-page days. And I also feel like you can't ask anything more from yourself than putting in the time. And I feel like obviously the product matters in the end, Like you can write, for 10 years, and if the product doesn't work, then no one's going to care. But I feel like while you're writing, you want to focus on the process. And so as much as you can, like put your hard hat on, sit down to work. I schedule my hours. And I tell my students to do this too. Say, okay, even if you don't write 18 hours, you need to schedule 18 hours for the week. And you have to schedule them don't schedule them at 4:30 in the morning when you're asleep, because that's cheating. But schedule them when you plausibly could be writing. And then when you if you don't meet your hours, then you'll see where you didn't meet them. And I think it's mostly to keep people honest, because it's amazing how much writing you don't get done when you don't write. And I think people can really delude themselves. The amount of time people spend online, just doing any sort of thing. So that's sort of practical stuff in terms of getting writing done. And then the other thing I'd say in terms of being your own best friend, it's not quite about imposter syndrome, but I'll get to that in a second. This is a bigger question, but about how you revise. But I always think that a big change at the root of the tree is much more effective than many small changes at the branches and leaves. I tend to write fairly long-winded, and there's a certain theme here, as you can see. I tend to write fairly long-winded critiques of my students' stories. And I'm also fairly prescriptive. I might know that that's not everyone's style, but that is my style. I tend to give prescriptive. You have to treat the story on its own terms. You don't rewrite the story. But I'll tend to be prescriptive on the story's own terms, and then it's up to the writer whether they want to fill out the prescription or not. But I'll often say, you should do the following 7 things, and I'll see the revision, and they've done the 7 things, and the story is exactly the same. Because, revision is that, revision, seeing something afresh. And what you need to do as a writing student is and you want that balance. I think of writing workshop as being good for people who don't fall in either extreme. One extreme is people who are so defensive about everything. They just want you to say the story's perfect, send it to the New Yorker. And, either that's true, and they say it, and it's unhelpful, or it's not true, and then you're upset. And it's also unhelpful because you don't want to hear it. So that's one extreme. And there's the other extreme, which I'd call the pleasers, where, there's a Yiddish phrase called ungepat. It's a little hard to translate, but it's a bit like a bouillabaisse. There's the whole stew. You take your 10 critiques, and you do this for Tom, and this for Keisha, and this for Alex, and it's incoherent. And so what you really need to do is to think seriously about what people say to you, but then make it your own. Don't do it because someone told you to do it. Because you'll get 10 different opinions from 10 different, you probably get 20 different opinions from 10 different people. So in any case, I do find, I will sometimes say to the writer, well, have you thought about, maybe the parents shouldn't be divorced. Maybe the father should be dead, because have you ever thought about that? And often the writer will say no. And I'll say, well, are you willing to think about it? And sometimes the writer will say, no, that just so runs counter to how I think of the story that I couldn't write the story. And that's a totally reasonable response. But sometimes the writer might say, or should at least contemplate saying, I hadn't thought about that, but I could see how doing that might help my story. In other words, I do see students who are very business-like. I don't mean business in terms of the business of publishing. I mean business-like in the sense of being practical-minded. They're very business-like about how they understand what it takes to make their story work. And there are some students who are like, don't fuck with my vision, which is fine, but there can be a kind of stubbornness that will, leave you and your vision to play chess with each other. So that's all by the way of sort of practical matters. But I actually think that the reason I'm focusing on this is I do think that focusing on the practical allows someone to move away from imposter syndrome, because you kind of get into the weeds. I do think it takes a certain amount of chutzpah, a certain amount of audacity to write fiction, because you're basically saying strangers should care about your little story. Strangers should care about these people that you've invented. But you know, if you do it well enough, they will care. And if you don't, then you tried. And you'll try again with another bunch of characters. And certainly whatever else, you're not harming the planet. You're not doing all sorts of worse things that you could be doing with your time than writing fiction. So, or poetry, or playwriting, or any of the arts. So I do think that as much as you can bracket that question of imposter syndrome and get into the weeds, the easier it will be. But I do think that it's a lifelong process. I mean, I tell my grad students this, and they don't like to hear this, and they don't believe it, but it's true. But I do think in a way that they're in the best position they'll ever be in. In terms of the world of publishing. I mean, obviously they have to write their books, and they have to be good books. And I'm not saying that's an easy thing. But I can tell you that I have friends who have written fourth novels, fifth novels, that no question would be published if they were first novels. But because of their sales track record, they are having trouble publishing them. And so, I mean, publishers want debuts and bestsellers, which is, I'm not trying to get you guys nervous, but you only have one chance to be a debut. So just make that book the very best book it can be. Don't be in a rush. Some of you might have read Robert Jones Jr.'s The Prophet, which is now a finalist for the National Book Award. And if I were a betting man, and I am, I think he's got a good chance of winning on November 27th. He was our student. He started that novel in our program 15 years ago, published it last year. So, good things can come to those who wait. So I guess what I'm saying is immerse yourself in the work. Be proud of the work. Be proud of doing what you do. And try to block out the noise. Because the noise is always distracting, and it will continue to be distracting even after you publish your book.
Hi. First off, thanks for coming out here. Second, you sort of touched on it, but in creative writing workshops and stuff, it's really easy to get dependent on critique and feedback to sort of guide you to the trouble areas in your story. And my question is basically, how do you find those spots when it's just you and like after college?
Say, how do you do it without workshop? Is that what you're asking?
Yeah, basically.
Yeah. No, I mean.
I know there's not an easy answer.
No, it's not. And I mean, it's one of those weird things where I think a lot of people take writing workshops to make them write. In other words, to have those deadlines, to have people depending on them. And that's a perfectly legitimate reason to be in a workshop and to be in a writing program, whether as an undergrad or a graduate. And I think that certainly by the end of a 2-year MFA program, a lot of our students are kind of workshopped out and they want to never be in a workshop again. And then like a year later, 2 years later, I start to hear from them and they miss workshop and, and I think it's a very hard time right after you graduate because you kind of, as much as people sometimes resent workshop and resent the process, it can be scary afterwards to recognize that no one cares if you're going to write. And that continues to be true. Even when even your editor probably doesn't really care if you're going to write. Let's say you've sold your book. Doesn't really care. Unless you're selling so many copies that you're paying, Penguin Random House's electricity bill. And then you have actually different kinds of problems on your hand. That's not such an easy position to be in either. But unless you're in that position, which, most of us are not, no one really cares whether you're going to write. And if you don't finish your book, then you have to send back your advance. So that's kind of life post-workshop. So I guess what I'd say is a couple of things. I do think that the best thing that you can get out of an MFA program or an undergraduate writing program, even more than your instructors, are your peers, are people in the workshop. In other words, you learn I think one thing you need to do in class is you have to learn whom to listen to and learn whom to tune out. And it's not because the people whom you listen to are smarter than the people you tune out. It's just that, certain times you're sometimes in aesthetic agreement with certain people and less so with other people, though one caveat. I mean, when I was in MFA, there was a guy in my workshop. I just thought he was kind of I liked him, but I just thought he was kind of an idiot. And everything he said was wrong. Everything. And then he saved my last story. So sometimes your best reader will not be your best reader for story X, and sometimes your worst reader will be a really good story for story Y. So you do have to keep an open mind. But beyond that, I do think that a program is about, and a workshop is about finding peers who are your readers, hopefully for the rest of your life. I have a guy, there's a guy who was a couple years after me at Michigan where I got my MFA, who really saved my last two novels, certainly one of them, and maybe even, he is just an amazing reader for me, and he really found some like root problems. And so there are ways in which you can transport the workshop experience after workshop through your peers who could serve as your critics. Although, I do think that once you're done with workshop, you do want to get to a place where when I started writing, I was really insufferable. I couldn't write a paragraph without showing it to someone. And now I've veered to the opposite extreme, and I really won't show anything until it's as far as I can get it. So I do think you can bring that with you after a program. But I also think that I kind of feel strongly, at least the way I teach, that a writing workshop is really, and that a writing program is really a reading program. And what I mean by that is you can teach talent, but you teach people how to get out of the way of their mistakes. And although everyone is most excited, anxious, nervous when they're up in workshop, the times you're up in workshop are actually the least helpful weeks of the class, I think, because you can't, at least at that moment, you can't hear anything. You're too close to the work. That's why you take your critiques home, because, you look at them 6 months later and you're like, oh, that's what Josh was saying. I just had no clue what he meant at the time. But I think what really happens in a writing workshop is that you learn a lot from the other people's work, because in figuring out what isn't working in their stories, you are figuring out what isn't working in your stories. And so I think what you're doing is teaching yourself, and with the assistance of an instructor and of peers, teaching yourself to be a better, more self-conscious reader. And what I mean by that is we all react instinctively to the work we read. We either like it or don't like it. And I think it's actually important to trust your instincts, but then to move past them. In other words, to trust your instincts, but then to try to understand them. Why did this passage move me? Why did that passage fall flat? Why does this character over here jump off the page? But there, she feels more wooden. Why is the narrative trajectory different in the last third of the story? How is the story being gummed up by flashback done this way? And might I do flashback in a different way, or might I eliminate? All those kinds of questions that we bring to bear when we read other people's work are the kinds of things that we can bring to bear on our own work once we've learned those skills. David Foster Wallace, late David Foster Wallace, in addition to being a well-known writer, was a serious amateur tennis player, interviewed Roger Federer there used to be a sports section, a sports insert in the New York Times Magazine a few times a year. And he interviewed Federer, and Federer talked about something called learned intuition. It sounds like an oxymoron. What does that mean, learned intuition? You intuit something, you don't learn it. But he said, no, there is learned intuition. You hit the ball over and over and over again until what you once did mechanically, you're doing instinctively. And when you go into a room and you turn on the light, you don't stop and think about, the history of electricity or how circuits work. You instinctively know how to turn on a light. But stroke victims, for instance, they really have to relearn things that they knew instinctively beforehand. And I think that to me is what a fiction writing workshop is about. It's a reading class. It's teaching you to be able to read your own work the way you read other people's work. So you can in some way be your own workshop. And that's of course hard because we all see other people's work more clearly than we see our own work. We all see other people more clearly than we see ourselves. That's just, one of the predicaments of life. But I think that especially when you're writing a novel, depending how you write it, this is one reason I like to write a lot of pages and not go back too soon. Because if I go back immediately, I can't see the prose clearly enough because the rhythms of the sentence are still in my head from when I wrote it yesterday. And so I can't see it afresh. But if I'm on page 400 and I haven't looked at page 7 in 2 years, then all of a sudden page 7 looks to me as if I never wrote it. And then I can become the critic for my own work that I am for other people's work. So again, that was long-winded, but I'd say hold on to your good readers and teach yourself to be a better reader through reading so that you will be able to see, looking back when you revise, what's working in your work and what's not working. Other folks? Yeah.
About people being close to their work.
I don't hear that well. Can you talk a little louder?
Sorry. You mentioned being too close to your work during a critique. How do you find the balance between putting that distance between yourself and your writing and also not becoming too removed?
Going too removed, you said?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So again, that's a great question. I mean, I think there are two versions of Tuke. I guess a macro version and a micro version. So, well, I mentioned before that my favorite scene in the novel is gone from the novel, and I won't go into the details because they're not particularly interesting, but just in brief, Spence, the guy who develops Alzheimer's, is a professor of Shakespeare, and in an earlier draft, he was a professor of art history, and it made zero sense that he was a professor of art history. I couldn't do it, so I don't know enough about art history, but also he's deeply an ascetic. And although there in theory could be an art historian who's an ascetic, in general, we think of art historians as being about the physical, about the body. And but I was very committed to his being an art historian because the scene that I love so much was really contingent on his being an art historian. And at some point, I was convinced. It didn't take that much convincing, but at some point I was convinced that that I had to change things and I have to lose that scene. So all that's my way of saying is that you have to be practical minded, and you can't just because you love something doesn't mean it belongs. That would be one thing I'd say. But then I'd say even more broadly, I think all fiction has to be emotionally autobiographical. And what that means is that the writer has to feel on the line, the writer has to feel at risk. Because if the writer doesn't feel at risk, there is no feeling coming from the writer. If there is no feeling coming from the writer, there will be no feeling for the reader. I mean, sometimes there's feeling coming from the writer and there's still no feeling for the reader, but it's at least necessary, if not sufficient, for there to be feeling coming from the writer. And so I think for a book to be emotionally, or a story to be emotionally autobiographical, it has to in some way be close to you. But that's not to say that the details, the facts of the book have to be true. And so, one thing I think that we're always trying to negotiate is between what is true narrowly, which is not particularly interesting, and what is true fictionally or aesthetically, which ideally is more interesting. The first workshop I was in as a student, there was a young woman in the class who wrote a story that was transparently about her breakup with her first boyfriend. But it was actually a much better story than that thumbnail sketch would suggest. And, we all said what we thought was working in the story. And then there's pretty much agreement that there was a particular scene that just was not working. And when it was her turn to talk, she said, well, that scene that you thought wasn't working, it actually happened. And, the appropriate response to that is a kind, gentle version of, so what? That, it doesn't matter that it happened. And sometimes what happened is not as true as what didn't happen. And so I think when you think about your material, it has to feel close enough, not in terms of the facts, but close enough emotionally to your lived experience that it will be infused with emotion. But if you're so concerned about fidelity to actual truth, you will get into trouble, because actual truth doesn't matter. You're creating art, and even if you're writing memoir, I understand that with memoir, you can't exactly lie the way you lie in fiction. But even memoir there's an aesthetic truth that's different from actual truth. Not a transcription of your life. A transcription of even the most interesting life is boring. Transcriptions are boring. So there needs to be enough distance. So if you feel like you're telling the story because you want to get certain facts out there, it's probably not the story you want to be telling, because that's not the impetus behind fiction that works. That's the macro question about too close versus too far. I guess what I was referring to before was more micro. Just like, I would say that 95% of my work is on getting the story or getting the scene, the book, from 95%. In other words, 95% of the work is on the last 5%. And I've done this, if you look at the final draft versus the draft before, in between which there was 95% of the work, an untrained eye, an insensitive eye, someone who doesn't read fiction might look at it and say, well, they're not really that different. But they are very different, because the change of the pause here, the dialogue tag there, the decision to write in summarized dialogue as opposed to actual dialogue, so that there's a kind of stepping back, a vantage point. All those things have an impact. And those kind of revisions, I find, are very hard to do if you've just written it beforehand. So what happens is I'll put it away, and then I'll come back and have another go at it a few months later, and then I'll put it away again and have a go at it still after that. But I'm even during copy editing and proofreading, I'm still having a go at it. And if I were allowed to make changes as I gave a reading from a published book, I would still do it, because I'm a compulsive. But I think you have to be compulsive to get things exactly right. So in other words, there's like sentence level closeness, and then there's macro. I think you may have been referring more to macro closeness, maybe, but they're both important. And I think that for micro closeness, it's just about having enough time to be able to see it afresh. And for macro closeness, it's more about understanding that the fact of what happened are not important, just not important. They're important insofar as they can help you aesthetically, and they're a hindrance if they hinder you aesthetically. What are you all working on? You're working on short stories? Yeah, I assume most of you are writing students, and you're working on short story. Tell me what do you like to read? Who's influencing you? I'm very interested, because I'm sorry? What authors inspire me? The influence. Yeah, I know it's the question we all dread. In other words, because I don't like to choose among my children or my siblings or my parents, whatever they are. And I also think that it's weird, and it's hard to, at least for me, it's hard to know what influences me. Like sometimes work I don't like can influence me as much as work I do like, where I'll be like, I better not do that. So, well, it's going to sound like I'm saying this because I'm here, but you should read Martha's work. I mean, you should. I assume you have because you're her students, but if you haven't, because occasionally one hears of students who haven't read their instructor's work, read her work. I would say more broadly, I try to read eclectically, because I think that there are many different kinds of writing, and I think you want to experiment and you want to learn from people who are different from you. I would say instinctively, I was thinking about Martha's introduction and what she was talking about, what her father said, because that's kind of how I feel in general about deceptive simplicity, that it can be very hard, take a lot of time to write simply. It often is easier to write in more complicated fashion, not always to the best effect. So I tend, just in terms of my own aesthetic, to be drawn to writers who get out of the way. And what I mean is, I understand very, very well how in the way they were in the process in order to be able to get out of the way. But what I mean by get out of the way is limited pyrotechnic, limited showing off. You kind of feel like the story is telling itself, even though, of course, it isn't. A writer like Elizabeth Strout, for those of you who haven't read her, I think she's a real example of that, of writing, and I'm also of writing of a writer who gets out of the way and who, like in a book like Olive Kittredge, but in any number of her books. And I'm interested in writers. I mean, she's not the only one. I think of Alice Munro as another writer who I so admire, and I've learned so much from her about structure. Like Alice Munro is someone who taught me that structure can be beautiful. And this is something I talk about with my grad students, because so we have about 300 applicants every year for 12 to 15 spots. So it's really hard to get in, and our students are very, very good. But a lot of them struggle with like just telling a story. They write a really nice sentence and they have a good sense of character, but they're not good at telling stories, and they have built up all sorts of aesthetic defenses about how telling a story is not important, it's bourgeois, it's crass, it's all sorts of things. And part of what I spent 2 years doing is disabusing them of that notion. But one thing that Alice Munro really does is she teaches you that structure actually can be beautiful. And it's not simply, I'm usually able to get my students to understand that structure is necessary. They start out thinking that structure is unnecessary, that their pearls of brilliance will just, win the reader over. I'm usually able to get them to understand that structure is necessary. But what I'd like them to really understand is that structure, if well done, can be beautiful, that the kinds of choices you make about how you tell your story are aesthetic choices, and they have emotional impact. And Munro is someone who does that. And Munro and Strout and so many other writers are also writing about the quotidian details of life. I'm really interested in writing about the seemingly mundane and tilting it in a direction that makes it resonant. I tend to be drawn toward work that's quiet but deep, less drawn to work that's action-packed, that could easily be a Bruce Willis movie, with all due respect to both movies and Bruce Willis. But those are my own predilections, but I certainly read a wide array of work. And I would encourage people to read a wide array of work, because that's how you get better. I was talking before about memoir. Tobias Wolff's memoir, This Boy's Life. That's an example of a memoir where the writer really got out of the way. And it's just an incredibly powerful memoir. Came out a long time ago, but still one of my favorite books. Yeah, I mean, I can try to deepen. I wish I could be more specific. Because I honestly don't remember what it was about that book that made me figure things out for my book. And I would also say that I think if someone read Joan's book and read my book, they themselves, in other words, I will be more specific, but I mean, part of the answer is I think that sometimes you get inspiration from places that you wouldn't necessarily expect. And so you can read a book that's very different from your own, and it can teach you a lesson that it's a little bit like, I mean, I kind of think of it a little bit like therapy. Like, your therapist may tell you early on something that's true, but it's not helpful because you're not ready to hear it. You have to be ready to hear things at the right time. And I think I think if I'd read Joan's book in year one of writing my book, I wouldn't have been able to find it helpful. I would have still liked the book. But so I can't remember. But what I will say is that I think, and I could be wrong here, I'm really going on memory and speculation. But I do remember how I structured the book beforehand, and I know how I structured it in the end. And so I think what I was struggling with, and this may be only meaningful to those of you who've read the book, because then we're really getting into the weeds. But here's another way. Here's another way of looking at this. I had read another book while I was reading this book, The Great Believers by Rebecca Makkai. Also a really, really good book. And I think in its early stages, in my book's early stages, I was influenced by the structure of that book. And for those of you who haven't read that book, there are two narratives in that book. There's kind of a 1980s gay men getting AIDS in Chicago narrative. And then there's a present day narrative in Paris that involves an adult child who's gone missing, and her mother is trying to find her. And the way Makkai structures that book is she really toggles back and forth between the two narratives in short, and it works very well for that. Although I love that book, I think the Chicago narrative is the stronger narrative. I like the other narrative less. Chicago narrative is tremendous. But although I like the other narrative less, I think structurally they work very well together. And it's kind of a jigsaw puzzle structure, because the character in 2017 or whenever is barely alive in the 1980s narrative. And I mean, she may not even be alive. And the structure is sort of jigsaw puzzle-like, that you're kind of trying to figure out how the narratives are connected. And there are a bunch of novels that work that way. I mean, Lisa Halliday's Asymmetry. I mean, some would argue that those aren't even connected at all. But there's a whole series, there are many novels out there where part of the plot or the structure of the book is sort of piecing together how the different strands work. And because the present narrative in the Makkai is very much like, let's find someone missing, it has its own propulsive energy. And so Makkai was able to kind of go in a pretty herky-jerky way, but without suffering for that, going from one narrative, one chapter, next narrative, next chapter, back and forth, back and forth. And in earlier versions of this book, I think I was unduly influenced by Makkai. So, and I was really writing multiple narratives, like, Sarah, the Prudence Spence's daughter, she's probably the character who lost the most pages. I mean, she's still a fairly major figure in the book, but she was much more major originally. There are just pages and pages and chapters about her and her boyfriend out in LA while she's in medical school, her and her dog dying. There's lots of stuff. Some of it pretty good, some of it pretty bad. but all of it not relevant to the book ultimately. But what I was doing is I had like a chapter while Spence was getting dementia, and then a chapter while Arlo was on the Commune, and a chapter while Sarah was in LA, and then a chapter here. I mean, it was just, and I think given that I didn't have that jigsaw puzzle like structure where you actually knew who the characters were in relationship to each other, so that wasn't driving the book forward, the attempt on the reader's part to figure out how people were connected. And because you knew who all the characters were, and because you didn't quite have a narrative that was like a missing persons narrative, and this is actually a broader issue, but a struggle that I had with this book that anyone has with any book about Alzheimer's, is that, I tell my grad students, don't write a story about a ball rolling down a hill, because you write a story about a ball rolling down a hill, the ball's going to roll down the hill. And that's unfortunately true about Alzheimer's, at least as of now medically, that the medicine of it, there is no suspense. The ball's going to roll down the hill. And so the suspense of the book has to revolve around the other characters. And so a lot of the struggle with this book was trying to find enough agency, enough stuff going on with the other characters, the characters who are lucid, to drive the book forward. And I was finding that earlier pinball-y Rebecca Mackay structure, which worked perfectly for her book, was not working as well for my book because of the number of different narratives, the lack of a mystery about the connection between the characters, and the lack of an obvious kind of like thriller-esque sort of narrative of missing person. And so I believe what Jones Silber's novel taught me was to think of this book in larger chunks. I mean, there are 8 sections, so it's not like any of them is hundreds of pages long. But previously, they were just like chapter here, chapter there, and it was really only unified by the fact that these were the same characters, and it wasn't really building. And I actually think this is a good lesson for novelists in general. Not that all novels are the same for sure, but one thing I see with my grad students is that when they're moving from short stories to novels, as some of them are, and I by no means think that novels are better than short stories. Sometimes I prefer stories, but I do think that people are used to writing stories. One of the things they struggle with is that bigger arc. They're used to writing short scenes, diving for the white space, and so one of the nice things about novels, you can settle in for a long period of time, and teaching yourself to think in bigger chunks can be helpful. And I think that with this novel, I think that's what Jones' novel was doing, because if I remember correctly, that novel preceded it. I mean, her work in general moves associatively, really interestingly through time. She's very influenced by Monroe. She's a wonderful writer, Joan Silber. She's really underread. Really, really read her. She writes linked stories in general, and she writes novels, but even those novels are linked stories. But that book was teaching me how to think about bigger swath, to move from a Mackay structure to a Silber structure for this particular book, because that's what the demand. Uh-huh.
Backstory structure. I know we just spent a while talking about it, but my question is kind of about I have a problem where, like, kind of like what you described, like I love to describe things and like write things that I think are like aesthetically pleasing or whatever, but then when it comes down to like actually getting rolling, it's a little bit more difficult. I have trouble with the idea of like outlining something because by the time I'm actually writing it, like it kind of takes like my own surprise out of writing for me. Like, how do you, on one hand, like pre-plan the plot or like to know what's going to happen, but then still keep like the fun of actually writing, like, and the surprise of writing when you actually write it?
Yeah. Another great question. And I spent a lot of time thinking about this and talking about this with my graduate students. I don't map my work out, and I know people who do. And I understand the advantage of that, but if you map your work out, you do run the risk of getting what a friend of mine calls lifting cup a story, where you're injecting your characters into a preordained plot. And, the relationship between plot and character is complex and symbiotic. We both create our stories and are created by them. We think we're doing one thing, and then a character surprises us and takes the story in a different direction. So there are certainly risks to mapping work out, although it can be done for sure. And then there are risks on the other side to having just writing a lot of pretty sentences about sunset. And so, you do want to try to find that balance between knowing too little and knowing too much. And I guess what I'd like to do is I think about, I don't know if you've been to a Passover Seder, but at the Passover Seder, there's the 4 questions. Why is this night different from all other nights? And that question gets asked in 4 different ways. And that's the mother of all Passover questions, and it's kind of the mother of all fiction questions. You're writing about a set of characters, and why today? Why this set of days? What's important? What are the stakes? And so I think, Alice McDermott, I'm thinking about other writers I love. So Alice McDermott, another writer I love, has a book called The Weddings and Wakes. And I think she's on to something. Set your stories at weddings, wakes, funerals, bar mitzvahs, Thanksgiving meals. You basically want situations where characters can come in. You need conflict in fiction. That's the real problem that my students face, is they're conflict averse. They want to write stories about watching. And while a certain amount of watching can be tolerated in fiction, there needs to be more than watching. And we need conflict in fiction. And so if you have a passive, you see a lot of stories where the imitative fallacy comes into play, where you have a passive character and therefore a passive protagonist and therefore a passive story. It's fine to have a passive protagonist. You just can't have the story allow them to be passive. So I think putting your characters in situations where they feel high stakes, where something can happen, where there's potential for conflict, that's the way. You will often bark up a lot of wrong trees, but it's good to get yourself in the right forest. And I think the way you get yourself in the right forest is by asking that Passover question, by putting yourself in situations where things can happen. But then I'd say, I often tell my students to look at their stories and highlight in yellow everything that could be film, and then highlight in blue everything that cannot. Everything that can be filmed is taking place in actual time and space. Everything that cannot be filmed is internal in some way, is not taking place in actual time and space. And different stories are different, but most stories are going to have some of both. And if you tend to write in such a way that you have trouble setting things in scene, that you're just wandering around, you might want to try to make sure your story starts in scene. What I'll see a lot of my students do is they flashback way too early. They write the first sentence, and then the second sentence, they're back 10 years ago. I think there's something like complicated psychologically going on for all of us. So many of us write better about things that have already happened, as opposed to with things that are happening right now. Because there's something about like, oh my God, we're in scene. There's a kind of a ceding of control. Whereas if you fool yourself into writing in flashback, it becomes easier. But then if you see a story that's 85% flashback, it's usually the case that, well, that story should just be set back then. In other words, why is it taking place now? There are exceptions for sure. But why is it taking place now if only 15% of it is taking place now? So I guess for people who struggle with this, one thing that you might think about it, there's what I call a BACD structure. And Jennifer Haig, who's another writer who you might have read, she taught for us one semester. She went to Iowa. She might have liked Iowa, and she might have just been like ragging on Iowa for the sake of our students. But she said, the only thing I learned at Iowa was BACD. And what she meant is that it's a temporal structural Your first story takes place in scene in real time. And you do not flash back for that whole scene. In other words, you commit This is your occasion for the telling. Your brother has just come home for Thanksgiving with a new partner whom your parents hate. And that opening scene is Thanksgiving dinner, and it lasts for 3 pages or whatever. Second scene is A, namely flashback, but carefully selected flashback. It's not just the history of you and your brother. It's flashback that in some way informs the here and now. And then C is moving forward in the here and now. And it's obviously not the only way to write a story. There are many other good ways to write a story. But you'd be surprised how many stories kind of follow that template, that BACD template. And it's a kind of sort of an invisible structure. And there are variations of it, C, B, D. I mean, you can play around with the alphabet in all sorts of ways, and but once you've what it does, without being too much of a blueprint, is you've set your scene in the first scene, so the reader understands what the occasion for the telling is and why what's happening is important. The second scene gives you a kind of context to understand, so that it deepens and informs what's happening in the here and now. It allows you in the third scene to move forward in the here and now. It also opens up the possibility of further flashback later down the line, because sometimes you'll see a story that takes place entirely, very much in scene in the here and now for 17 pages, and then all of a sudden on page 18, the writer decides to go into flashback. And it's not that you can't do that, but that often will feel weird, because you've been so immersed in the here and now for 17 pages, and it feels like the writer has said, whoop, I forgot to tell you something. So every story is teaching you how to read it. The writer can do anything for the first word of their story. And then the second word is beholden to the first word, and the third word is beholden to the first two. And so you are teaching the reader how to read your story. And so if you have a story where flashback might be important, it might not be such a bad idea to give us some flashback in the second scene, not in the second sentence. And I'm not saying you can never flashback in the second sentence, but I see too many people reflexively going backward instead of forward. But if flashback is going to be important, it might not be such a bad idea to have some flashback on page 3 if you're going to need it on page 14 and on page 24 as well, because then it's going to feel less abrupt. So you're always teaching the reader how to read the story as you're writing. So yeah, it's a much longer discussion, but that's one way to start thinking about the question of how to move forward and the balance between knowing too much and too little. Thank you, Martha. I really appreciate. I'm happy to sign them, and would love to talk to you all informally. And thank you for having me. I mean, I've never been to Hofstra, and I only saw it briefly between the car that brought me here and the library, but it looked beautiful. So it seems like a good place to be. So anyhow, thank you so much for coming out. Appreciate it.